DeMeo, and with me today is Suzanne Nixon, who's a psychologist in the D.C. area, and she's been helping families for over 20 years. And we've been talking about mission statements, which is a very interesting subject that I want to explore with her.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So this mission statement idea, I think, is awesome. Can you explain that a little bit more?
I can. It's based on Stephen Covey's work. He wrote the book, The 7 Highly Effective Habits of People.
Right.
And then he saw what a success that was for businesses. And what he did was he brought it down into the family system and saying, if businesses have a mission statement that drives the way that they work and their goals, shouldn't family systems have a mission statement that really begins to name their values, their principles, and their goals, that becomes the driver of how a family begins to behave and act in the world?
No, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I think of it in terms of a blended family situation when you have two different already established families that are now going to merge together. But it would be helpful, I think, for an intact family to come up with a mission statement.
Actually, Regina, it's helpful for any family to have a mission statement because it defines where you're at, what's really of value, how do you want to live your life right here and now, and what are the kind of choices that you want to make consciously about how you spend your weekends, your days, or your years.
So when a family comes to you to talk about a mission statement, what are the kinds of questions you want them to think about?
Well, usually they don't come to me and say, I want to talk about a mission statement. Usually I'm the one that defines it. So if there's choices to be made, if your choice is whether you want to live in Kensington or do you want to live in D.C., well, there's some factors that are involved with that. So a family meeting of sitting down, of saying, what's really of value? Is it important to go to the school system in Kensington or the ones in Washington, D.C.? Is it going to be public or private school? So beginning to define your values and your principles and what's important and having everybody contribute to that will define whether or not perhaps you choose a home in Kensington or D.C. or public or private school.
Now, do you have kids come into the meetings as well sometimes?
Absolutely.
You do?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So this is something that can be done with couples or can be done with the whole family.
Wow. And, I mean, what do you do with when, like, you have one person, for example, I went to boarding school, right? So I had the fortune of having a scholarship, and I had an amazing education at a very early age. But a lot of people I've met are like, well, public school is just fine. So we all have our sort of biases based on some of our experiences. When you have a couple with completely different experiences and biases, how do you bring them together?
In a family meeting, you would each share your perspective and help the other to understand your perception of what you're saying. So if you have a partner and you're talking to him about your experience with boarding school, the goal is for you to help him understand what was of value, what you learned, why it was so meaningful, so that he really gets it. He may then come from a perspective of why public school was so important to him. So you come to understanding. There's not going to be a right or a wrong or a win or a lose. It's, let me understand your perspective, and together, let us be curious about what the decision's going to be.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense, yeah. So have you had experiences with families that send their kids off to boarding school?
I have, but I've worked with them as adults.
Oh, okay.
So I work with the adults that have gone to boarding schools and what their experience is. But I haven't worked with kids that are in boarding schools.
Okay. I mean, are there things that come up a lot, like as a result of having gone to boarding school? Are there common themes that people struggle with afterwards?
Not that I've seen as a pattern. I mean, there's usually a reflection of the identity that they have with the boarding school and what it really was for them insofar as their heart and their sense of belonging and their sense of identity and their sense of connection. So they may form a very tight, secure bond with the people at the boarding school. But then there was a family system that I know of. I didn't work with them. They were an acquaintance. But they would send their children to India to boarding school to be educated. And so they would be away from their parents from September until July or whatever their school season was. And they just did this as a matter of routine. Well, for the kids, this was really difficult. They didn't really want to be there. They really wanted to be home with their families.
Well, that's funny because when I went to boarding school, when my best friend is actually a legacy child, she just wanted to go home. She loved being home, and those first few weeks she was miserable. And meanwhile, I'm the kid from like the wrong side of the tracks is like, this is paradise. What do you mean you want to go home? So yeah, I think parents have a different view of what it's going to be like, and I don't know that every parent realizes that there's a trade-off. Like if your kid is growing up away from you, we grow up very independent.
Yes,
but,
you do.
there's a bond that won't exist the way that I see my friends who stayed home. They have a special bond with their parents.
But what's really important is the psychology of the child, which, just to kind of bring that in, there are some children that can handle a boarding school, but there's others that can't.
Right.
And they may feel lonely, they may get depressed, they may feel anxious, they may have social anxiety, they may isolate. So you also have to be aware that psychologically some kids could go into depression or anxiety if they went away from their parents. So a lot depends on the child and the secure bond or attachment and identification they have with their parents. And it may be a child that works, it may be not work.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
So do you flag those issues with
Absolutely,
parents? Yeah.
absolutely. I always look at the whole self. So it's going to look at the educational self and all the merits a boarding school can do, but also the psychological profile or disposition of the child and what's best for the child. And then let that child have a voice. So with your friend that went away that was really lonely, I would have said, second month in, let's have a family meeting. Let's talk with your parents. Let's really talk about what your experience is and come to some understanding. You may still go to boarding school, you may not, but let's talk about it.
No, it makes perfect sense. Same thing with, I'm sure you see this a lot, like kids that are very athletic, right? And the parents, like, sign them up early on, and they don't really know what's going on, and this kid has this amazing talent, and it just sort of takes off. Do you deal with those issues as well?
Well, what I deal with is how does the child feel about being in sports, and then what repercussion does it have on the family system? So if you get a child into sports, and maybe they're talented, and they're really great at soccer or baseball, and they begin to do that, I like to bring consciousness and intent, which is driven by the mission statement, as to should we do this next year? Should we do this next year? Should we do this next year? So the 6-year-old kid that's playing soccer on the weekends, by the time they're 15, they may be playing for the school. They may be playing on the travel team as well as the intramural team. So soccer becomes their way of life. I try to bring consciousness to the parents. Is this the way that you want to raise your child? Are these the kind of experiences that you want to give them? I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think most people don't think of it thoroughly. Like, for example, once again, I got signed up for gymnastics at an early age, and it turns out I was really good at it. And next thing you know, I'm traveling all over the country, and I'm spending my summers at the Olympic Training Center. But it wasn't a conscious thing. It wasn't a plan. We didn't review it every year. It just sort of happened, and it took over my entire life.
And now, years out, what do you think about that? How do you feel about that? What would you have done differently? Would you have liked it if your parents sat down and gave some thought to what you were doing?
Well, I mean, I loved my experiences and they were great, but there were trade-offs. I mean, if you're traveling all the time, it's very intense and you don't have time to make a lot of friends. You're not hanging out at the playground with your friends. You are not spending your weekends just, going to the pool with the local crowd. You're not. Your entire life becomes that sport.
Right, and what's so great about mission statements is then it brings the issue to the table, and then you make a conscious choice. Is this how I want to live? Is this how I want to be as an individual, as a teen doing the gymnastics, or is this something else I want to explore?
Right.
So to give you the choice by asking the question, which is based on what your values are, your principles, and what you really enjoy. And then to see how your family could support it. Because the other thing, Regina, is then, was your family supporting your gymnastics?
You mean financially?
Financially, showing up, behaviorally,
yeah.
Cheering you on, and were they showing, and
yes.
did they like that? And
yes.
Is that how they want to spend their time?
Well, you're right, because it impacts everybody, not just the child.
Everybody. Right.
So what happens if the child is really into it and the parents are not? Do you have that happen?
Absolutely.
Or the reverse?
It becomes a conflict. So again, what I go back to is let's have conversations about this. Let's see what we can figure out as a compromise between the two. Because you want to support the love and the passion of your child, but there's also some realities about how you want to live your life, perhaps time and budget, what's doable. So I work with compromise.
It seems like it would mostly be driven by parents because, right, the child, I mean, I don't, as smart as I thought I was at 14, the child doesn't really know the long-term implications of certain decisions, whereas I would imagine the parents have hopefully put more thought into it.
Well, my perspective is that we need to teach our children that. We need to sit down and teach our child and say, okay, if here you're age 14 and you're going to be doing gymnastics now for the next 4 or 5 years, what are you going to be missing out on? what will you regret when you're 20 years old and you look back and you say, wow, I didn't just have spontaneous play, or we didn't go weekends down to the museums. I've never gone to the White House or the Smithsonian. Instead, I was at the gym.
Right.
I was at the meets. Is that okay? Now, that may be okay, but at least bring some consciousness to it. So then the choice becomes a conscious choice, and then you become more mindful of how you're living your life. Make sense?
Yeah, so you're actually trying to empower the child.
Absolutely. And the family. Empower everybody. So let's pay attention to what we're doing. How are we living this day, this moment, and what kind of repercussions and impact is it going to have on your life in the long run? And for everybody.
Right. No, it's very democratic. Right?
Yes, it is. Actually, you're right on. It's a democratic system.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's other families, I won't go into my own situation, but, that are much more like, I'm the dictator, and you are here, you're going to do as I say.
Right.
But.
And then how does that impact family relations?
Exactly. Yeah.
What's the connection? What's the attachment? What's the real relationship between the child and the parent?
And have you seen the overscheduled child as they go into adulthood? There's certain implications. Like I require a lot of stimulation. Like you get so used to always being on the run and always being like in a very intense environment that it's part of who you are even as an adult, and it becomes very hard to just hang out, to just have downtime.
Right.
Do you find that is a common theme with these overachievers?
It can go a couple of ways. I mean, now there's more research that's coming out about it. So we look at the overscheduled child, and because I look a lot in health and wellness, I work from a very holistic model, we're beginning to see that the overscheduled child not only doesn't know what to do with their alone time, their independent time, and gets bored and doesn't know how to spontaneously play or create, but we're also seeing that they begin to impact a lot of stress in their body. And so what happens is
What do you mean?
Well, if you're constantly overscheduled, you may also have some kind of a feeling that you have to constantly be achieving and be successful and be perfect or reach another goal or another goal or another goal. And so you get on that roller coaster of actually being a little mini adult at a very early age or as a teen of what is valued and what's important, and what's really the driver is you being successful and you being talented and you being multi-talented in whatever endeavor you're pursuing. That's going to create a lot of stress on the child. The stress to keep up, the stress to achieve. And then how about when they come home and they do their homework? I mean, are they coming home from gymnastics practice at 9 o'clock at night? I was a Jimmy, by the way, too.
I know, you told me.
Are they coming home at 9 o'clock at night and then having to do their studies?
Yeah.
Study for their SATs or their SOLs, and then getting to bed at 1 o'clock and waking up the next day at 6? What does that do to the child? Well, internally, that can create a buildup of stress. How is the child managing that stress? Anybody talking about that? Does that create depression, anxiety? Do we know?
Right.
So you can think of your own life. Maybe you are the kind of person that you could adapt to the being highly scheduled and you thrived on it. But there are other people that don't thrive on it.
No, you're totally right.
And then it creates psychological difficulties and challenges as they get older, and also affects their ability to form relationships. Because spontaneous relationships are not formed if you keep on overscheduling a child.
That's a great point. We're going to come right back after a short break.
Okay.
Now, some action from the courts. Billie Jean King renewing her rivalry with arthritis. First set, furious volley, and right to the net for a winner. Beautiful forehand there. Arthritis, stunned. And here, match point. Billie Jean with the ace, taking it in straight sets. Afterwards, a jubilant Billie Jean King.
Tennis is a weapon for me with arthritis. There's nothing like it for me to hit a ball, run to the ball, anytime, any court. I'm ready. Let's go.
What's your weapon against arthritis? Find out at fightarthritispain.org.
Welcome back to Making It Last. I'm Regina DeMeo, and with me today is Suzanne Nixon. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So we were talking about like the overscheduled child, right? And let's say you have one that can actually deal with it rather well, but you have another sibling in the house who is more laid back and just kind of wants to hang out. So how do parents deal with that with two different children?
You know, it's really complicated, and then what happens is that often we see one parent going with the child that's very active and scheduled, and one parent staying home, or we see the child being, what I would say, often dragged to the events of the overscheduled child, and then just being more of a witness or a bystander to that child's process or their activities. So there has to be...
That can't be fun.
It's not fun. It's not fun. I remember with my own children, my son was really into soccer, and his sister's 4 years younger. So often she had to go to the soccer games, and as a single mom, I had to take her to the soccer games, or else we didn't see him play.
Right.
And so at times she wouldn't like that, and I really needed to pay attention to that. And sometimes then the compromise was I missed seeing his game, and I hung out with her and did something different. And so we each had to deal with our own disappointments.
Right. How do you get children to actually sometimes speak up about their emotions? Like I find with my son, he's only 8, but he might be upset, and I have to sort of drag it out of him and articulate, like, he'll be mad, and I'll think it's about one thing, and then it's like, well, what are you really mad about? I'm not sure I quite understand. And finally it turns out, well, you didn't fix my laptop from, 3 days ago, and you promised you would. And that was so not even on my radar.
Right.
So how do you do that with kids and say, hey, it's okay to speak up and say, I don't really want to go to that soccer game that my sister's playing? How do parents encourage?
Well, first, what you're doing right is you're thinking about that question first, that you really want to get to know what your child is feeling and what they're experiencing, what they're thinking. So right away, you're off to a really positive start. Read the nonverbal expressions of your child. Usually, their faces are going to tell you what they're thinking and what they're feeling. So you get to know your child and understand their body language. And then when you anticipate there may be a feeling, ask them, especially for boys and for men, instead of saying, what are you feeling, you say, what are you experiencing?
What's the difference?
Because men and boys tend not to go to feelings as readily and describe them. It's easier from a neurological point of view to ask a man in particular, what is your experience? If you think about men, usually they say, you're always asking me what I'm feeling. I'm telling you what I'm feeling. But if you ask the experience, then they have an internal check-in point to see what's really going on with them, and usually a feeling comes out. So the same with boys. They may not at first identify with feeling as a daughter may. So you may say, well, what's your experience right now when we're sitting at the coffee table, or we're sitting at the kitchen table, and I see a face, and you're kind of looking like you're thinking about something. What's going on in there? What's going on? So you kind of cheer them on. And then you may get to a place where you say, well, what are you feeling? And then if he says, well, I don't know, and you say, well, I'm wondering if you're disappointed, you're worried, you're happy. So you give choices for how they're feeling and see if they pick one of those choices. Usually they will.
Interesting. Now that's a good technique.
Yeah.
So do you think that some parents, I hate to, but a lot of people in this area, I will just leave it at that, are so focused on work. They really are. And then their own, especially now, whatever their struggles are, finances or whatever, that they just sort of, unless a child is able to be like, hey, I'm here, they're getting through the basic necessities, and they're not really developing an emotional bond with their kids.
Yeah.
Do you see that happening?
I see that a lot, especially in this area. There's many two-parent workers, and the children don't have as much quality time. But then we go back again to the mission statement, which is why this is so beautiful. What's really important for this family? Is it important to have family relationships? Is it important to have quality time together? What's really important for this family? And then you've got to make the time. So I really suggest that families have at least 15 to 30 minutes of time with their children every single day. Now, when you think about it, 15 to 30 minutes doesn't sound like a lot, but if parents are coming home from work, and then they're making dinner, and then they're sitting and they're having dinner, and then children do homework, where's that 50, 30 minutes coming in? But you can consciously make that time to do that, and then you'll be more successful in developing a relationship with your child and being able to understand your child.
Now, you don't mean 30 minutes while watching TV together?
No, I don't.
Okay.
No, it's not like, but sometimes you may have just hangout time, but there's something special that will happen. So if it's watching TV, it's a favorite show, it's muting it during commercials and talking about it.
Okay.
It's maybe snuggling a little bit at the appropriate age, and having a conversation or some kind of touch involved so that there's a connection between the parent and the child.
No, that makes sense.
And then I recommend the same for parents. that parents need to have at least 15 or 30 minutes a day of
Just
sitting.
the couple.
Just the couple. Just the couple. Because you're either growing in connection or you're growing in separation.
Right.
Every day. So every day I recommend for families to realize that. You're growing in one direction or another direction. We're always changing. So make a choice of how you want to grow. Right? So if you want to grow closer to your son, if you want to understand his emotions, what do you want to do? You want to spend some time talking to him, being with him.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, for now, I think, our big time together after dinner, after homework, it's that reading time. That's like my favorite time with him, to just sit, we read books, we talk about the books and the stories, and he'll start to unwind and talk about his day and ask me about mine. That's our 30 minutes, I guess.
That's terrific. That's great. And does he enjoy that?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And actually, we started talking about the book that you recommended,
Yes.
The 5 Love Languages of Children, which I would love to do. Do you want to talk about that a little
Absolutely,
bit?
absolutely.
Okay. That is such a sweet book.
Yeah.
So it turns out, no surprise, mine is quality time. But not everybody has this, in the family, not everybody will have the same love language.
That's right.
So is that part of something you talk about with families, is figuring out each person's love language?
Yes, I do this a lot when I do marriage therapy or I do counseling, relationship counseling, and now I'm doing it more with families. That each of us has a way that we feel love, and that's what's important to think about, is that you like and you feel love when somebody does something with you. And for you it may be, if you spend time with you, if your partner spends time with you, then you really feel loved. And it's really precious time. But there are other people that's not their first love language. They much prefer words of affirmation, which would be saying something like, you know what, Regina, I think you're terrific, you're awesome, and I love the fact that we're in a relationship together. That may really make you feel loved and make you feel special. Or you may say, you know what, I'd like to just sit down and have a cup of coffee with you and let's talk about your day. You may prefer that. So each partner in a marriage needs to know what the love language is of their partner and begin to love them in that way so they feel what they call their love tank being filled. And then the same has to go with your children. Children have a preferred love language.
Well, when they're little, I mean, how do you just try different things out to see which one they respond to best?
Yes, but most children, infants, the love language is touch.
Okay.
So it's just a kind of a no-brainer that children love to be hugged and touched. I mean, there are a few children that are touch avoidant, which is a different subject, but most children want to be touched. So physical touch is the first language of infants and usually of toddlers. But then they'll begin to show a preference. Is this the child that can sit by themselves at age 3 and play by themselves for 30 to 45 minutes? If it is, then they're really quite independent and they don't need the quality time perhaps of the parents sitting next to them. They much prefer, say, if your child is sitting next to you on a little blanket and playing with their Legos, of saying, wow, you're really doing a good job building that Lego. That is awesome. Will you show me that after you're done? Or the child may prefer you actually sitting next to them and playing the Legos with them. So one is words of affirmation, and one is quality time of play. Your child will indicate which one they prefer.
Okay.
Okay?
So what if, for me, unfortunately, words of affirmation do not come easily, right? I have a very high standard. I had very high standards imposed of me, so I'm not really going to say you did a great job unless you really did a great job.
Yeah.
Okay? But let's say my child, that's what they need. So do you tell parents that they need to start to work on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say to you, that's your learning curve.
Uh-huh.
Your learning curve is that wasn't important or a value or necessary for you when you were growing up, or perhaps now, but it is for your child. So your child needs to hear that in order to feel loved. Do you want your child to know that they're loved? Then you need to learn that.
Right. And same with the spouse.
Exactly, same with the spouse. I remember one story that I really was tickled about is that there was a couple that was married. I saw the husband for therapy. And he came in and he told me once that he would send his wife flowers every week to remind her that she was really loved. Now, he got this idea because he knew that Joe DiMaggio, and when he was courting Marilyn Monroe, he used to send her flowers once a week.
Okay.
So he thought this was like the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Right.
So he would send actually when they were engaged and they got married, flowers once a week. Well, after about, I think it was 10 or 12 years of marriage, she finally said something to him. She said, you know what? I loved it when you sent me flowers when we were engaged in the first year of our marriage, but after that, I could have cared less. And meanwhile, he thought that that's what she really wanted.
That's so funny. So it's okay to say to somebody, like, I appreciate it, but you don't need to do this.
It's necessary. It's absolutely necessary. Because then we go again back to, is this couple growing in connection or separation?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And, you know, I have to say that, like, the one that I think people miss the most, and I mean, again, I don't mean to stereotype, but guys in particular, I think they're really into acts of service or acts of kindness. You know, like making sure they pick up your favorite tea at a store. And I think women tend to generally, like, not necessarily pick that up. Like, hey, you know, I took your car to the car wash and had it washed for you, and you're like, okay, thanks. But we're not realizing that that's actually a form of their expression of love. Do you see that happen?
Yeah. So this is what happens, is that there are some things that we do because we love our spouse, but there's other things we do because we're responsible adults and citizens.
Good point. Right.
So it's then defining and kind of separating out which is about love and making that person feel loved, or which is about just taking on a responsibility and just making it easier for the marriage or the family system to do one of these tasks or chores. So then again, you go back to the conversation. If his assumption is, I'm doing this because I love you, and she says, well, I think this is really neat that you're taking my car to the car wash, but that doesn't make me feel loved. What makes me feel loved is when you sit down next to me and you put your arm around me and you just give me that smile and that look in your eyes and we connect. Then I feel loved.
Oh, it's perfect. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So I like to help couples and families identify their love language. And then that ensures that their relationship and their family is going to be healthier and happier.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. If somebody wanted to contact you, how would they go about finding you?
I have a website, and it's www.mindbodytherapy.org. And a phone number, 703-729-0505. And either way that I can be reached, and I actually return calls and emails within 24 hours. So you're more than welcome. If you have any questions that you want to ask from the show, something that I've said that kind of lit your thought process, I'd be happy to give you a dialogue about that or a quick email.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure, and you're doing some great work here. Keep it up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if anybody has any show ideas or wants to volunteer to be a guest here, please feel free to contact me at genxmarty@gmail.com, or you can go to my website, reginademeo.com, and contact me that way as well. So it's been a pleasure being with you today. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you next week on Making It Laugh.